Yeah. Okay, thank you. That's great.
Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome again. Nice morning so far. I'm from Mekki, and on behalf of Seneca, I would like to welcome Mekki MacAulay from York University. He's a PhD candidate in strategic management. Open source strategy research is his specialty, and he's from the Schulich School of Business at York University. He holds an undergrad degree from Carleton University, and he's also a licensed professional engineer. He's a founder for OSSstrategy.org, a consulting firm in strategic management, and the mission for which is to build business models and strategic planning. So, Mekki, we would like to welcome you to Seneca.
Thank you. Good morning. You are mostly in the wrong room. This is not a very interesting talk. You might want to go next door. But thank you for your interest. We can. Well, one of the ways I like to do that is I'm at the Schulich School of Business across the way here, and when I teach, I hate to lecture. I think it's boring. I'd rather have a group discussion. So I encourage my students, and I encourage all of you, that throughout the presentation, just jump right in. Let's have a discussion. I always have way more slides than I actually need. So if we don't make them through, who cares? Let's chat. Jump out, make a comment, ask a question, tell me I'm full of shit. That's totally cool. Like, I want to have that sort of discussion going on there. That being said, I don't think I'm going to say anything incredibly controversial, but incidentally, if you want to grab these slides that I'm going to be presenting, you can pick them up here, OSSstrategy.org/FSOSS. Never spell it, 2013.pdf or .ppt or .odp, depending on your preference. And if you want to read the very long and boring draft paper that this talk is about, it's 70 pages with a lot of academic jargon. You're welcome to look at the draft. It's terrible, but it's getting better. It's the same first part, identity.pdf. So feel free to grab these, take a look at these. Like all the work that I do, everything's licensed Creative Commons by, so attribution. Feel free to take the work, mess around with it, and give me feedback on it. Part of this is a learning process for me, so I welcome your feedback. This is my my blog for research. If you have any thoughts about my research, I'd love you to email me, and so we can hear more about it. So jumping right in, my background is computer engineering, and I figured out a number of years ago that while I love to rip my hair out debugging missing code, like we were talking about in the last presentation with Julian, I'm more on the business side of things, and I find it really interesting. I've started a couple companies, and I noticed that business research is really divorced from what's going on in open source. You talk to business people about open source, and they're still at the, but if we give it away, it doesn't mean we're going to go bankrupt, and they can't get past that. It's really challenging for them. So I made my mission doing my PhD to figure out how to communicate with business people and understanding that open source doesn't mean you're going to go broke. And in fact, it can be a huge competitive advantage for your business, so long as you do it right. So I began interviewing people in open source communities, and I'm fortunate because Seneca and its partners, Mozilla and OpenOffice and others, have been very helpful in my research. And I started to get a picture of what was going on in these communities so that I could start that translation process. And one of the things came out was the very powerful identities that people have in open source communities. In the business literature, it's talked about inside businesses. How do employees develop an identity in a business, and how does that affect their productivity, the teamwork, the churn, the likelihood that they're going to quit and go to another company? And I began to realize that's very similar to what goes on in open source projects. We have these identities that we build up ourselves and in these communities, and it affects the productivity. It affects which open source projects are more or less popular, how people move between them. So I started to dig a little bit deeper. So that's sort of what I'm going to talk about a little bit today, and it's a little bit on the academic side, and I apologize in advance for that, because that's my target audience in the business schools. I have to write to the publish or perish game. Those of you who are academics, I see you nodding your heads, you know a little bit about that game. So, but we can still discuss a lot of this, and I hope it will be relevant to people who are stewards of open source communities and how they can make them better and continue to grow them. So jumping in, what do I mean by identity? So when I first pitched this presentation, I said identity, and people went, oh yeah, you mean authenticating online. No, not that kind of identity. When I say identity, I mean a short answer to the question, who am I? That's the most basic form of identity. If you say to somebody, who are you? The first thing that they answer is the most powerful part of their identity in that construct. That's the short answer to what I mean by identity. The long answer is there's different ways of classifying identity and different types of identity. In the 80s, one of the constructs was personal identity, which is idiosyncratic characteristics such as bodily attributes, abilities, psychological traits, interests, and many other things. Commonly researched ones are race, religion, hair color, eye color, gender, sexual orientation. There's a lot of these traits. What's distinct about personal identity is that they're typically fairly grounded, and you can usually narrow them down and at least point your finger in the general direction of what the characteristics are. And then you have this other thing called social identity, which is something that we do when we look at groups and we say, am I one of them? Social identity is the answer to the question, am I one of them? So in the case of open source, people will say something like, I am a programmer, or I am a person who does documentation, or I'm non-technical. You hear people say that a lot. I'm not one of those technical people. What does that really mean? It means I see a group that has a bunch of prototypical characteristics, which means that there's a stereotype associated with them that I have in my mind, and I look at that stereotype and I say, do I match it? If I say I'm not one of them, then I'm deciding I'm not one of those people. If I say I am, then I sort of feel that some of those stereotypical characteristics might apply to me. And what's interesting about social identity is that it's very difficult to look at Evan over here and say, what group is he a member of? How does he identify? Well, I can't really look at him and tell. Unless he tells me, oh, I'm a technical person, I can't necessarily judge. So social identity can sometimes be invisible. And that's where it gets really interesting, when we try to figure out people's invisible identities and their effects on their community involvement. Another interesting facet about identities is that we don't have just one. People have multiple identities, and these identities frequently overlap. Which identity is most salient at a given time is based on context. So I just said technical, non-technical. You all went in your head, oh, am I technical, am I non-technical? If I had said, oh, male or female, you all would have went, oh, well, I'm male, I'm female, or I'm not, or I something else like that. The context can be triggered. And open source communities are very powerful contexts that are constantly shifting. So this conference is a context. We have certain identities that come out of this conference that don't come out when we're at home. So when we're at home, my context might be father, mother, brother, sister. That's the salient identity, and that triggers my role in what I'm going to do in that context. When I'm at the college, my salient identity might be an educator, it might be a professor, it might be an administrator. And that's going to be the context in which the most salient identity characteristics come out and affect what I'm going to do in that environment. It's exactly true in open source environments. And so the gentleman up there in the last talk was talking about PyCon. PyCon is famous for the big blow up last year with sexual harassment. We've heard about that in the media. And one of the interesting things is talking about a safe environment for women in programming spaces and in open source. And this is where context is key. Safe environment means a context where identities that come out are okay, they're safe, they're not pushed to the side and marginalized. And figuring out how to negotiate that context is very tricky, and PyCon has done a lot of stuff to try and make that happen. And they're known to be some of the leaders in that space. And other conferences are following them to figure out how to do that. But the important thing to remember here is that there's multiple identities, they overlap, and they're contextually specific in their relevance. So we talked about this a bit. When individuals are exposed to groups, they go through a bit of a process that we call a comparison. We look at the group and we say, am I one of them or not? And then they do this self-stereotyping activity. What's interesting to note about the self-stereotyping is that it doesn't happen until they are exposed to the group. If you think right now, what are all the stereotypes I apply to myself? That list is going to be very small. But if I put in front of you a list of different groups, it's really easy for you to say yes, no, yes, yes, no, yes, no. You have to be able to be exposed to those groups. Another thing that's interesting is the stereotypes of those groups do not necessarily have to be real. And you might still apply them to yourself, and you might still act out those stereotypes as a result of doing. So there's an enactment effect that goes on. By putting on a particular identity mantle, we behave in the way that we associate mentally with that. It kind of follows suit. So let me give you an example. A particular gentleman might have a lot of money and a lot of partners and a bunch of behaviors. If you put the mayor's mantle over, if you take it off and you put on a hoodie, he's the buddy of a bunch of drug dealers in a famous picture. In which context are the most salient characteristics of those groups coming out? So when he's in the chamber, he's assigning to himself characteristics of administrator, of someone who's professional and all this stuff. He wears the tie. I bet his language is very different. Is his language different because he doesn't know how to talk other languages, other forms? Or is it different because he has put on that mantle and it's become the stereotype for that context? When he's with the drug dealers, I wager his vocabulary is very different. Is it because he is actually physically a different person? Well, it's because in this context, different identity is salient. He applies that stereotype of this is what people in this environment talk about and applies it to himself. We all do this unconsciously all the time. When I put on my suit jacket and I stand at the front of a room, I take on the stereotype of someone who's presenting. I've got to stand straight. I've got to be somewhat professional. I'm applying that to myself. Was it my identity before I got down here? That's a very interesting question. And it might not matter. The effects are still the same. So exposure to groups, how we recognize the stereotypes and how we apply them to ourselves is part of the process of identity development. Individuals aren't the only ones with identities. Communities have identities as well. Community identities are classically defined as the members' shared beliefs about the central, enduring, and distinctive characteristics of the community. So a classic example, yes, yeah.
But how can you say that you have agreement on that?
Great question.
100%.
You don't.
They're trying to, they're supposed to be the place of whatever, sober second class. Well,
Yep.
I don't think they're too sober today, and they're not acting as one entity.
Absolutely.
So I put out to you, could you speak to that?
You have just addressed to a 10-year research stream in the literature. 10 years people have spent trying to answer that question. And so there's no one right answer. In one context, shared beliefs might be each individual belief aggregated. 10 people believe these, 5 people believe these, 5 people believe this. In other contexts, it might be the belief of the most powerful person versus the beliefs of the less powerful people. In a different organization, that might be the consensus. There might be no consensus, so the shared belief might be a lack of shared belief. It varies by organization, and it's an important question to ask, how are we measuring that? You are bang on with that. There's no one way. So the best question is to ask, why are we trying to measure it? And what's the best way to measure it for whatever reason we're trying to measure it? In the case of open source, we tend to look towards metrics that we care about in communities. So what are the shared beliefs about the central, enduring, and distinctive characteristics of Mozilla? Well, usually we go to the manifesto. That's what it's there for. It is a statement of the shared beliefs and the distinctive characteristics. Does that mean that every member agrees with them? Maybe not, but it's a part of the community identity that was deliberately thought through and then put out there. And that alludes to the fact that identities can be multiple directions. It can be how people perceive me, how I want to be perceived, or how I internally perceive myself. There's different facets to it. And I can give a whole talk on that, it gets way too academic-y. But you touch on a really, really important thing. Communities have amorphous identities that might not be agreed upon. And more interestingly, within the community, they may be hugely contradictory, as in the case of the Senate. And how do you negotiate that? When individuals join communities, as we talked about, they go through this comparison process. What's interesting about the comparison process is that it's not binary. It's not as easy as what I just said. Am I one of them or not? Because communities are bigger than groups. They have too many different aspects. And so, absolutely. So how do those new senators, and I'm glad that you're tying that in as a comparison to open source community, because it is the same thing. How do those new senators cope with the, I'm an identity as a senator, but oh my God, all these horrible things? They cope with it by breaking it down to piecemeal constructs. Identity becomes a bunch of different factors, and I can do a comparison process with each one. So in my research, some of the common ones that come up with open source communities are degrees of openness. How important is the principle of openness to me relative to the community? So the classic divide is the free software perspective versus the open source perspective. The principle is openness, but the degrees of agreement on what that means shift. That is a form of identity comparison. Another one is the acceptability of making money. Some people believe it's incredibly acceptable to make money in open source. Other people believe it's negative and it's bad for open source communities. That is another identity comparison process that happens. And the result is some degree of identity gap between the individual and the community. And the size of this gap here, this distance, is based on the sum total of all these little comparisons that I do to see how far I am from total agreement with the community. So in the case of the Senate, it might be on the issue of abortion, I'm far from the majority leaders. On the issue of tax reform, I'm here. On the issue of spying, I'm here, and so on and so forth. And the result is a net gap. There's always going to be a gap because at 0, we have perfect agreement. And pretty much by definition, you can't really have perfect agreement. But the size of the gap can vary tremendously from very little to very high. And the relative comparison of community to individual, as we just pointed out, is very fuzzy. And it's very contextually based because community identity is fuzzy and overlapping, and individuals have multiple identities that are contextually based. So this comparison is necessarily incredibly varied.
You could say the same thing for the happen when people leave community, right? Like in the sense that they feel a sense of, they might have had agreement before, but then they feel a sense of alienation.
I love it when people allude to my next slide. It's wonderful. You are absolutely right. There are outcomes to this gap. And one of the outcomes is if the gap is too large, people will leave. So tying it back to open source communities, minimizing this gap is a success factor for open source communities. If the gap is too large, people will leave. They may also do other things. And that's where it gets really interesting. I'm so excited you guys are passionate about my research, because most people are like, who cares about this stuff, you know? You guys are really engaged, it's great. So what are some of the effects? Now we get into the, the citations and the boring stuff. Just look at this column right here. This is what the 10 years of literature that I was talking about has identified at the individual level of all the different things that can happen when that gap is too big. It can affect commitment, cognition. People can engage in ego protection strategies where they get really stubborn and bitter. It can affect motivation, performance, sense making, which is how they understand their context. They might start to conceptualize things differently. So for example, they might think that it's not really a meritocracy. Maybe there actually are things going on behind the scenes. That's sense making. And so on and so on. I'm not going to go into all in detail, but the point is that there's lots and lots of effects. And those are just the individual effects. It affects interpersonal as well. It affects work groups, all these different things, group cohesion, how much people want to adhere to org culture. I don't know about you guys, but I worked in government and I couldn't deal with org culture. I was a rebel. I'm like, this is nonsense, you know. Julian was talking about the last presentation about the anti-computer culture at elementary schools, and he's like, why do you need passwords on those computers? You know, that it's cultural, but we sometimes disguise it as technical because we do sense making and say, no, this is a technical problem. So it affects cooperation, participation, trust, which is hugely important between team members, and it can create conflict. It also affects things at the organization level, which is even bigger. So it can affect the collective support of the organization. Forking, anyone? What do you think forking is? It's a breakdown of collective support of the organization. Creative destruction, which can be positive. Breaking down an organization and rebuilding it from scratch to do something better. Adapting to change. Ego protecting strategy is the organization level. So this is dinosaurs saying, no, 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 we don't need to adapt to the internet. The internet's a fad, it's going to go away. That's an organizational ego protection strategy. And so on and so forth. Legitimacy is important too. So academics talk about government funding, and yesterday the deans were talking about, how do we legitimize open source as creating jobs in Ontario, of creating economic return for a gross domestic product, and so on and so forth. So legitimacy as a research field or as an open source organization that's contributing to society is a huge factor, and identity absolutely plays into this. So the major takeaway from this first part of the presentation is identities matter. They matter a lot, and they have major impacts at individual, interpersonal, or group and organizational levels. And one perspective to look at it is to look at the fuzzy, individual, multiple, overlapping, contextually specific identities and compare them to the fuzzy, not necessarily agreed upon community identities with different salient factors, and to try to get some sense of a gap. And if you find a way to quantify that with any consistency, I'll be really impressed. I've never found a way to quantify it. Thankfully, my research is mostly qualitative, so I can describe it. And on that note, what does this look like when you talk to people? This is what it looks like. And for confidentiality reasons, I can't tell you who this person is. And if you can guess my anonymizing theme, you get bonus points. But several people in this room know this person. I can tell you that. And this person said, I don't share my motivations that my friends at Persephone. Persephone is an open source project that I've anonymized. I am the guy who is taking their product and rebadging it so that it can be used by corporations. I am not like them because I have profit motive. The contextually salient identity facet is the acceptability of making money. This person has made more contributions to open source than I will make in my entire life, but felt, I am not a member of this community. I do not share their identity because I'm trying to make money. And I somehow feel that that's wrong because it's different from the community's identity. And so I feel like an outsider. I am not one of them. Perhaps the most interesting part of this quote is that another person that I interviewed said the exact opposite about Simon Tam. Said Simon Tam is the model person of a core member of this community. So internal perspectives of identity can be very different from how outsiders accept them. But the gap is clear. On the acceptability of making money, there's an identity gap, perceived or real, it doesn't matter, between this individual's motivations and the community's identity. And that has an issue. That causes problems. It can be a serious issue. Here's another way that it looks. This is a long quote, so I'm going to read it to you because I think it's so powerful. This person said, I didn't really like what I was doing. You have to sign 1 billion confidentiality agreements. What really frustrated me was that people have these little puzzle pieces on their desks, and that puzzle pieces represent a patent that they filed. They're displayed as awards. Patenting an algorithm or an idea like that is completely the opposite of what I think humanity is, right? We have to share ideas. We have to work together to improve, not hide things. So here, the contextually salient identity facet was openness. And this person was frustrated with the community with which she was a member in that they valued patenting and locking things down, and that was really important. And her identity was really different. And we'll see later on how that changed over time. Can anybody guess my anonymizing theme yet? No? Oh, okay. I want to pause for a moment, 1, because I'm coughing, 2, because I want to get your feedback before I jump into more concepts. You want, yeah?
Weren't the 2 prior examples themselves, I mean, well, the second one, can it also not be implied that it was concentrating on the financial motive behind that? I mean, openness versus closeness and these patents are for protecting the company's self-interest for monetary compensation of the intellectual property. At the end of the day, it all goes back to
You could argue that openness and money are related. My research, as I sort of mentioned in the introduction, is sort of proving that that's nonsense. I don't think that's true. And in fact, some of the most successful open source companies have done so by letting go of trying to control the openness.
That particular example.
Oh, you're right. The organization that she was with absolutely didn't believe that. They felt that control equaled money. That I think that they were wrong is irrelevant. It was part of their community identity. And this person clashed with that. But her issue wasn't, I don't want this company to make money. Whereas the other person, that was the issue. The issue was about whether even making money at all as a member of the community was cool. And open source communities, there are some like that, where people who want to make money are shunned. That does exist. It's weird. It's usually more on the free software side, but it does happen. But she had no problem with the company making money. They were giving her a paycheck. What she had issue with is the way they were going about it. So I would argue they're different identity facets that are related, maybe overlapping a bit. Is that fair? It points to the fuzziness for sure, because it definitely is.
I mean, it's all pragmatism versus idealism.
Sure. Yeah. I'd buy that.
Different views of idealism.
Mm-hmm.
Because the idealism is I have to have full control to make money. That's one idealism, whereas the other idealism of open, pure openness.
Mm-hmm.
And then those 2 clash.
But I'm assuming most of their time is spent in these companies developing open source software. So at the end of the day, just from a survivalist perspective, you need rent. You need rent. I mean, you need money to get there, and that's it. It's just if I continue working at this, I need to make a living. That's the bottom line. So.
But some people disagree with that. Some open source communities and some of the most successful ones disagree with that. They want their community to be made up of people who are volunteers. You might disagree with that, but there are communities with that identity.
It's not nice. It's like, some of the communist ideas were really nice on paper. It doesn't really translate well when you try to...
Fair enough. So you would be somebody whose individual identity and ideals would not match with the community that is more communistic, if you will. And that's a perfect example of an identity gap. You're just giving a great example. And that came out in my research. It comes out all the time. Sometimes it's the other way. It varies person to person. And that's why the comparison is important. Each individual interacting with a given community will have a different experience. And so going back to the PyCon example, changing the policies of an organization only changes one part of the identity equation. It changes this part here. It doesn't change this part. And so by changing this part, it may be that a different subset of individuals would experience a gap. And in fact, by reducing the identity gap for some individuals, you might be increasing it for other individuals. So an important takeaway is that a one-size-fits-all community change might be dangerous. You have to look at the net reduction of identity gap across all the different community participants. And that's really hard, really, really hard. Proof, the PyCon fallout, there were a bunch of changes, and everybody on both sides of the debate hated them because the left said they weren't enough. The right said they were way too much. So the net identity gap might have actually increased, even though they were right. If we go to the Senate, going to the middle on a policy pisses off the extremists on both ends, because then instead of having 50% support, you have 0 support, even though your policy is in. This is what Obama has been dealing with over there. That's exactly what we're talking about here, and that's why this is such a difficult issue for communities to get right. I'm really glad you brought that up. That's really cool. Yeah. Anybody else want to bring up some other points before I jump into the next deeper level? We're going to do sort of a recursion thing here. You've digested all the stuff I've thrown at you? I'm really impressed. Yeah.
When you're diagramming the identity gap, you're trying to individuals, is there a notion of an identity gap between communities and organizations, or is that?
There is. The issue of gap I treat as requiring agency, meaning it's something that an individual has to do consciously or subconsciously, a comparison process. So if you ask the question, how do two organizations compare each other at the organization level, not their individuals, then we have to sort of come up with a new vocabulary to define what that means. So I don't really talk about that as much, but it absolutely exists. Greenpeace has problems with governments. And you could say as a whole, there's a gap between Greenpeace and a government policy, no question. But I'm not going to deal with that. What I am going to deal with is the next layer of recursion. What happens when an individual is a member of one community and a member of another community? So that's what this 70-page long paper here is about. The literature over the past 10 years has never looked at that particular circumstance. But in open source, it's super common. Very few people are a member of just one open source community. They're involved this project here, they do a little bit there. So for us, it's a big deal. In management, historically, they say you're only an employee of one organization. Who cares? And they talked about things like, well, maybe you're also a professional engineer, so you're part of a trade organization of professional engineers, but that's rah. But in open source, oh my God, the communities overlap by a huge degree. So that's where my research is doing the publish or perish game. I'm adding back to the literature saying, hey, look, organizations are now multinational, they work virtually, they have people who are inside and outside of their barriers of the company collaborating. We need to see what's going on with their identities. And so this is actually my original contribution. My research has demonstrated that there's multiple identity gaps. One between the focal community and the focal individual, and another one between the individual and a different community that they're a member of. So that itself is not so surprising. But what is surprising is that this gap here affects the outcomes of this gap. There's an interaction effect across the identity gaps. What does that mean? Yep, somehow I ended up with a blank slide there. What does that mean? It means you don't have to just worry about your community, its mission statement, and the identities of your community members. You also have to worry about the other communities that they're interacting with. Your members interacting with another community can affect the outcomes of your community. That is terrifying, because talking about control, you don't have control over that other community, and your members are going to be part of both of them. So when you're changing the policies of your community, your organization, not only do you have to know your members and try to minimize that gap, which is already extremely hard, you also have to know what other communities they're a part of and what the identity gaps with those communities are in order to get a full picture of the effect on that huge list of outcome factors. This is why I wanted to pause to jump into this, because this is a lot to digest. This is a huge thing, and I'm hoping to get a publication out of this because it's novel and it's huge. And you know, it adds another layer to our thinking of an already complicated process. So what does that look like when we talk to people? We're running low on time, so I'm going to go quickly through this, but this statement just blew me away. My jaw was open during the interview. There's a certain amount of tribalism at Instinct. Instinct is an open source project. Even with people who use or have similar philosophies and or use the same things you use, you can have an us versus them kind of thing. So there's a certain amount of, no, you must use this. If you're not a Vim user, you're a filthy Emacs user. Even among groups that largely share the same philosophy or the same goal, there's a slight antagonism. So this person was talking about being part of a community, and within that community, which other communities you were a part of determined your status. It changed how people would work with each other. People who used Vim clustered one way, people who used Emacs clustered another way, and those are separate communities that have their own development trees, their own mission statements, their own philosophies. They were affecting this main community, this focal community from my research. And this person was saying, it's affecting my motivation. He actually said that. He said, I feel like a bit of an outsider because I can't seem to win. No matter what I do, no matter what pure path I take, I'm always, you're doing that, you're doing that. It was an issue for him, and he pointed to very clear outcomes that were affecting his productivity. Another person, it was actually kind of positive. So this one here, the first one, it intensified the effect. Gap plus gap equaled worse. In this case, gap plus gap equaled positive. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but the context was this. A technical person who identified as technical was working at a hospital. And at the hospital, the value was all in the doctors and the nurses and what they can contribute. And so he felt like, I can't really do much here. I have this huge gap in terms of my ability to contribute. I'm not a medical person. I don't identify as that type of skill set, so I can't contribute to this hospital. Then he got involved in an open source community, a separate community, and he went, wow, I figured out how to solve real world problems in operating room theaters because of my membership in this open source community. I was a tech guy in a hospital and I felt out of place because the identity of hospital doesn't meet my identity. And I found another community where my gap was really small. I'm an open source guy, I'm like them. And it made my job experience better. I was happier. The identity gap that I had at the other organization was still there, but it didn't affect me as negatively. So frequently, people work at jobs because they have to eat, they have to feed their kids, and so on and so forth, and they don't like it. And they join open source communities to be around people who share their identity. And that can go back and help their work performance at their primary job. The same thing can happen between open source communities. That is a gap-on-gap effect that can improve. So note that it can be negative or it can be positive. Now the big one. It can also cause people to completely reconceptualize their identities. Excuse me. So back to Buffy Summers here. You really should be getting this one here. You know, like this is really obvious, guys. The anonymizing. Buffy Summers earlier was talking about how, you know, these patents are. Then she went and joined an open source organization that you all know very, very well. And she said, wow, it made me realize kind of what I was missing a lot in my job satisfaction, because I have difficulty not sharing information or sharing source code and ideas. Like, I really don't like redundancy when it comes to like, oh, I solved this problem. Hey, I solved it too. But we can't talk. Have you ever seen that in organizations? I worked in government. Believe me, healthcare.gov, anyone? Okay, no, so it drives me insane, she said. So being here makes me really happy, I guess. And if I was here and I still had to hide all the work that I was doing, I would be frustrated, but I would not know why. because I didn't know why I was frustrated until I came here and I was in an open source environment where everything was open and free. That changed my perspective significantly. So the previous organization that she was in, everything that she talked about the patents being, annoying her, she was not able to conceptualize, to speak to, until she went and joined the open source organization. She was passively frustrated, did not experience job satisfaction, was not as good at producing in her team as she could have been, until she went elsewhere and realized, aha, I'm an open source person. And that's why I was not a good match for that community's identity at that time. But she did not understand it at the time because the identity had not yet been fully conceptualized. She had not been exposed to that other group to even know about what open source is. This is where educators need to pay attention. Julian was just talking about students. Someone else was saying that even in university, they go, open source, what's this? Being exposed to open source ideals and those communities can be a reconceptualizing of identity experience for participants, and it goes back and has an effect on the other communities of which they're members. So in Ottawa, the open source community there actually has a powerful impact on politics. They use open source concepts and ideals as ways to go into civic engagement. So how they petition Parliament and how they teach people about laws, passing new laws, making changes to the Copyright Act was a big issue, for example. They use their experiences in open source communities to affect those political communities. And there's a very real outcome that happens from the cross-community effects. So the big splash there, the interaction of the gap of other communities can be positive on the outcomes of the primary communities. It can be negative, which is where we really want to be careful, or it can change somebody's conceptualization of their identity. And that's really, really powerful. And that's what we just said. So to wrap up, and then I'll open up the floor, from an open source community practitioner's perspective, the success of an open source community is determined not only by their mandate or their identity or their mission statement, however that's measured, and by their members' identity, but also in part by the identity of the other communities in which their members participate. That's the big extra aha, aside from all that first stuff I threw at you guys. Open source communities indirectly affect each other. We're in this together, and we have to break down those barriers across communities. We need to end the holy wars, because the holy wars do not just affect the communities in which they take place. They go outside those communities and affect other communities, possibly in negative ways. We have to be very careful about that. So if I can take a stab at our friend Linus Torvalds, who recently made public statements about the acceptability of harassing programmers on mailing lists, he has no idea how negatively that is going to impact other communities outside of Linux kernel development. For those of you not familiar with this, he essentially said, it's our mailing list. If I want to swear at programmers and tell them they're idiots on my mailing list, that's my right. What he doesn't realize is that that's not just speaking to the identity of his community and the identity of his managers, but it's going to propagate into the other communities that those people are a part of and have a negative impact there. And that is really important as stewards of open source communities. We have to realize that cross-pollination effect. So the holy wars and the debates, and that's talking about the negatives. So the open question is, how can we leverage that effect for the positives? And I'll leave you with that thought. Yes, sir.
Proximity in identity intensifies the antagonism in the gaps. So there's a grade that XPC, Omicron, crazy stuff, and every community practice. Or we see in free software and open source and like scientists, or I mean, a lot of people point out that the grand scheme of things,
And we see that politically, the left splitting the vote because they're fighting on infighting issues that's way off from what the right is doing. Same thing, yeah. Absolutely right. The comparison between religion and open source has been made by people much smarter than me.
It seems like it's almost because of the closeness to identity that you have the more defined and more intense.
Absolutely. I mean, a threat to a person's identity is amongst the worst threats. I mean, it can actually become physical from the brain's perspective. We become very challenged to defend our identities when they're threatened. And the more salient the identity is and the closer it is to a particular construct that we value, the more we're going to defend it. You're absolutely right. That's what makes the holy wars really dangerous. Do we really care about Vim and Emacs? Is that worth calling each other filthy? I love that quote. Filthy? It's amazing.
That when we share that much of our identity, those differences seem like more of a threat to our own identity.
Absolutely.
Do you identify with the person?
Yes, because then sometimes we see them as traitors. Because you're so much like me, but why do you use Vim? God, that's not acceptable. You laugh, but this happens. Like, it really does, right? You're absolutely right. It's easier to dismiss people that we don't identify with. They don't get it, they're Republicans, you know? You can just push that over there. But it's much harder when you identify with a lot of facets with the person, and then there's this one little thing that you can't reconcile. And that drives me crazy. I really, you know. Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up XKCD. I used to litter my presentations with XKCD references because they're perfect. You know, this one was a bit more academic, so I didn't. But the last slide actually is. There's always an XKCD last slide. Anyone else want to jump in, discuss this? I'm so glad about your engaging. Yeah.
When we look into the identity of open source, how the diversity in some ways of open source is a problem to establish an identity in this kind of way.
Absolutely.
I had a lot of discussions, but for me, the diversity is something that is very enriched. But a lot of people are telling me, but the problem is if we had one real system instead of all of this distribution, would be easier to present it to people.
Absolutely.
One desktop instead of all these files,
I agree. Yeah. Yeah. I think you're exactly right, and I think the parallels to politics are there again. So Canada has a multiculturalism approach. We say multiple identities are our strength. In the US, they have more of a melting pot approach, which is no, we all want to conform to the same identity, which is better. It's a matter of debate, and there's disagreement on that. So as stewards of open source communities, can we set up the community in a way that allows multiple identities and leverages their strength, like the Canadian system? I leave that to you as a challenge to figure out how to design your communities that way. So you can do that because there is strength to that diversity. How do you do that while minimizing the conflicts? Have we done it successfully in Canada? Depends who you ask, you know?
Bigger manifestos like what you mentioned are probably the best solution we have going on today. People should at least be gravitating back to central core principles that would govern. I mean, it's open to interpretation.
Yeah, and the manifestos can be pretty strict. I mean, Mozilla's is pretty open. It's, you know, we believe in the openness of the web, that nobody should own the web. But if you look at the Free Software Foundation manifesto, that's a little bit stricter. There's not as much room for leeway. That's why OSI made their own. So how do you keep a manifesto core enough that you don't cause fragmentation? Or is fragmentation okay and positive? That's another interesting question.
We're dealing with
Yeah.
beings here. That's common.
Yeah.
You know, even the example they mentioned, they don't use Vim. That could be this completely arbitrary thing of this person just being a child and just trying to be elitist because he's bored, and that could just as well be an excuse as anything else.
Absolutely. So how do we separate legitimate identities, if you will, from people being trolls? Good question.
What is the solution? Just to fire them?
Well, if we look again at the analogy to the political system, in Canada, our manifesto is the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, or one of our manifestos, and it says freedom of religion. So in Australia, the precedent case was a gentleman went to the Supreme Court arguing that he wanted to wear a pasta strainer on his head for his driver's license photo because he identified as a Pastafarian, and he said it's religious headgear to wear a pasta strainer on my head. And the Supreme Court of Australia said, okay, we cannot distinguish what is legitimate religion from what isn't without it falling apart. This has not been legally tested in Canada, but we do have people who self-identify as Pastafarians in Canada. Who gets to say you're not allowed to be a Jedi as your religion on the census? So, but our Charter of Rights and Freedoms says that you can. So are they trolling or are they not? You can't really separate that. The manifesto is not sufficient.
So long as they have a point, though.
According to who? Who decides if it's a point? In Linda's community, it's Linus. He says it's a point or it's not. That's it. And some communities are autocratic like that. But not all communities can do that.
Well, we're more democratic.
Who's we? Who's we? Who's we?
Canada.
See, you just identified an identity. You said we, and it was so internal to you, you didn't realize that we doesn't relate to everybody here. What does we mean to you?
I, as a Canadian citizen.
Okay, no, but I'm not trolling you. I mean it. When I say we, it can mean a bunch of contextual things. We say we as open source people. Well, what does that mean? One of the things that came out of my research that was most interesting, and I know we're almost out of time, was that I asked every single person I interview, what does community mean? What does the word mean? Just say community. And every single person had a different definition. Different. Every one of them. There's no agreement on something as basic as what's community. How do I know if I'm a member or not? No agreement. So how do we put that in a manifesto? When we say the Mozilla community in the manifesto, what does that mean? In law, we go through case precedent to define it, but can we do that in open source, or should we? You know, it's not as clear-cut as what I'm getting at. It's a tricky issue. But I'm glad you're passionate and engaged about it, and that we can have these discussions, because thinking about it is, you know, the starting point. So, thank you very much for your patience and listening to me. That's great.
Thank you for that passionate and interesting presentation.
Thank you so much.